Right. I know we're running a little bit late. I think we're going to have other people coming in as we begin because we did have an over subscription to this event. But I'd like to welcome you to the event. My name's Wendy Fenton, and I'm the coordinator of the Humanitarian Practice Network here at ODI. And I would like to welcome everyone in the room, as well as the almost 300 people who have registered to watch the event online. And today we're going to be discussing the findings and implications of our new network paper, Tug of War, Ethical Decision-Making to Enable Humanitarian Access in High-Risk Environments by Catherine Haver. This paper draws primarily on research conducted in Afghanistan, Somalia, South Sudan, and Syria, which are four of the most dangerous humanitarian contexts in the world. Ensuring staff safety in war zones while trying to get humanitarian aid to those most in need means that aid organizations regularly have to make difficult decisions on risk management. And compromise is almost inevitable. But aid agencies have to be able to manage these challenges without losing sight of ethical considerations. But how can humanitarian organizations actually help people caught up in conflicts when these conflicts actually make it dangerous for aid workers to operate safely? How can they stay true to core humanitarian principles when negotiating access in these environments? And are the current risk management strategies doing enough to balance these issues and ensure safe access? So our panelists here, reflecting on their own experience and research, are going to discuss how aid agencies and humanitarian workers can best address the risks and challenges inherent in decision-making on access in high-risk environments. But before I introduce our distinguished panel, could I just ask you to put your phones on silent, but feel free to tweet using the hashtag #EthicalAccess. Should the fire alarm go off, please leave the room, turn that way, and go out of the building. And you'll have the opportunity to comment and ask questions after the panel discussion. And we hope that those of you in the room will actually join us outside afterwards for a sandwich lunch and more discussion around these issues. So now let me go to our panel. We're very happy to have with us Catherine Haver, who is the author of the paper, joining us by video conference from Melbourne in Australia. So it's pretty late for you, Catherine. Is that right? And Catherine is Catherine's a partner with Humanitarian Outcomes, and her recent work is focused on delivering aid in insecure environments, as well as risk management, humanitarian financing and institutions, livelihoods and cash-based assistance. And before joining Humanitarian Outcomes, which is an independent research organization providing evidence and policy advice to inform better humanitarian action, Catherine worked as a policy advisor for Oxfam GB, based in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And she authored several reports, including ones on helping displaced people living in host families and better supporting community self-protection. Prior to that, she was a research associate at New York University's Center on International Cooperation. And Catherine's currently serving on the U.S. Board of Directors of ALIMA. To my right is Abdurrahman Sharif, and we're very happy that he's joined us. He's come all the way from Nairobi. He's the director of the Somalia NGO Consortium, which is a network of over 80 international and local NGOs working in Somalia, which is a highly insecure and complex operating environment and one of the focus countries for the research which underpins this paper. He's a graduate in languages from the University of the Sorbonne in Paris and holds 2 master's degrees, one in languages from the Sorbonne and another one in development studies from the University of Pavia in Italy. On my far left is Fiona Terry, who's an independent researcher who's been conducting studies for the ICRC. She holds a doctorate in international relations from the Australian National University. She's the author of Condemned to Repeat, the Paradox of Humanitarian Action, which I'm sure most of you have heard of if you haven't read it, and is a member of the editorial board of the International Review of the Red Cross. Fiona's been involved in humanitarian relief operations over many years in different parts of the world, including northern Iraq, Somalia, the Great Lakes region of Africa, Liberia, and along the Sino-Korean border. From 2000 to 2003, she worked as a research director with MSF in Paris. That's CRASH, is that right, with the CRASH unit? Before spending 3 years in Myanmar with ICRC. And then last but not least, on my immediate left is Imran Madden, who's had more than 16 years of experience in the humanitarian sector, including 11 years in leadership roles at Islamic Relief. He's currently the director of Islamic Relief UK. And Imran previously headed the humanitarian department at Islamic Relief Worldwide. He was a UK manager from 2000 to 2002, and emergencies manager before that. And he's traveled extensively in the course of leading some of Islamic Relief's biggest humanitarian responses in Sudan, Bosnia, Kosovo, Central African Republic, Sierra Leone, and Nepal. So you can see we have a wide range of in-depth experience in the sorts of contexts that we're actually talking about today. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to say. But what I'd like to do first is to start with Catherine. Catherine's going to give us a brief overview of the key findings and recommendations from the report, and then we'll start the panel discussion after that. Catherine, please go ahead.
Many thanks, Wendy, for the introduction, and thanks to HPN and ODI for hosting this event. And a warm thanks also to our three panelists, our expert panelists, for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. As a U.S. citizen, I must say something about this morning's news, as I'm still sort of very much in shock, as I'm sure many of you are. And just to sort of say something personal about this, it's something I've always felt strongly, and I think this is something that a lot of us involved in humanitarian work feel, which is that we don't get to choose the country we're born in. And I feel that I just as easily could have been born in Afghanistan or Yemen. And so today I actually feel a little closer to understanding what it's like to watch your country fall apart, be it from conflict or disaster, and really to not have much control over what's happening. Obviously, the U.S. is not, or at least not yet, in a similar situation to a lot of the countries that we're talking about today. But it is in the spirit of remembering that we are all one people, and that in extreme situations of war and violence, we would all want someone to be there to help prevent the worst from happening to ourselves or to our children. So it's in that spirit that I'd like to approach some of the research that we've been doing today. So as Wendy mentioned, the paper that you have in front of you is one of a few papers that's derived from a longer report. And this report tries to answer the overall question of what works for enabling access to humanitarian assistance in dangerous places. And this paper was launched this week along with other outputs from the SAVE research program. And you can find these reports on the website saveresearch.net. So I encourage you all to read this main report, which is called What It Takes, as it covers a lot more of these issues in more depth than this paper does. So just a bit of background on the SAVE research. The research took place over 3 years, from 2013 to 2016, and it involved in-depth fieldwork in some of them in the 4 countries that Wendy mentioned. So Afghanistan, Somalia, South Sudan, and Syria. And specifically for the What Works research, we interviewed over 500 aid actors, so those working for aid organizations as well as local private entities and other donors and government officials at the local and capital level. And we consulted over 800 affected people, including in very remote and sometimes dangerous areas. So this network paper, the tug of war paper, grew out of one of the observations that we had during the SAVE research, which was that even though in trying to secure access to dangerous places, humanitarian organizations routinely face very difficult choices and decisions that have ethical consequences, they somewhat surprisingly didn't tend to think about these problems in ethical terms or really see them as ethical problems. And at the same time, there are quite a few academics and often former practitioners who have thought quite deeply about these types of ethical issues, which of course frequently arise in humanitarian action, and they've developed some very useful frameworks and ways of thinking about them. So we wanted to put together these frameworks with some of the good practice examples from the research and to provoke discussion and reflection among aid practitioners about these ethical risks that they face, and to highlight how these different situations have been handled. So first, by way of explanation, just to note that by ethical dilemma, we mean a choice between two bad options, so where different moral imperatives contradict one another. So, for example, one decision that organizations often face is whether to start operations in a new area. That area may be under the control of an armed group, which may try to control who receives assistance or what they receive. And in doing so, the organization has to decide between, say, being fully impartial, neutral, and independent, or not doing anything at all. So why then aren't ethical decisions more openly or frequently discussed if they're sort of ever present in humanitarian work, especially in these high-risk, insecure contexts? And I think what we saw in the overall research kind of points to the answer to that question, which is that often to be able to work in these countries at all, organizations have to make compromises that they're not always comfortable with. So our research found that in all 4 of these countries, paying for access and granting concessions of different types were common practices. So this can include the very obvious types of concessions, like making payments at checkpoints, paying unofficial taxes or bribes to local authorities, employing a local militia to guard one's compound. But it can also include more subtle things like altering targeting criteria or just avoiding working in some areas altogether so as not to antagonize a local armed group or some other dominant community. Many times these decisions are made by local staff or in some cases by national or local partner organizations without a lot of discussion with the international staff or the international organization. And so really it's the ones on the ground who are facing these dilemmas and making these difficult choices. And so despite these frequency with which organizations are making these compromises, there is a tendency not to talk about them both within the organization and between organizations. There's this kind of culture of silence around them with a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy between senior and local staff or between the international organization and their local partner. So in the longer report and in this report, we discuss some of the reasons that agencies might be uncomfortable talking about such compromises. But one reason seems to be a misunderstanding or perhaps an incomplete understanding of the core humanitarian principles. Many of the agency staff we interviewed sort of insisted that, of course, they follow humanitarian principles, but there wasn't this sense of sort of having really unpacked what this means in specific contexts in practice. And the principles are very often in tension with each other. So living up to the principle of humanity, which is really, of course, the fundamental goal of humanitarian action to help and protect people in war and disasters, can require compromising on the other principles. And so it was that understanding of those tensions which we didn't necessarily see in most of the staff that we spoke with. And it's important to stress that these are incredibly difficult choices that are being made, often with real consequences for people's lives. And as I said, they're sometimes being made by very local level or often junior staff without proper support from senior management. There are often decisions made under time pressure and with incomplete information. So I'll run you through a few of the ethical risks that we saw frequently encountered during the research. So some examples, local armed groups pressuring aid agencies to work in their area or to avoid working in other areas, which can compromise an organization's impartiality. Second, an agency may be pressured to accept military escorts, which, for example, another example, which can compromise their neutrality or independence. Another one is just the difficulty of finding reliable local partners on the ground. And this can result in targeting that's biased by clan, ethnicity, or family or community ties. And just as a more general finding, as I mentioned, the SAVE research involved extensive consultations with affected people. And in 3 of the 4 countries, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Syria, they reported widespread bias and favoritism. They provided many examples of people who are undeserving or wealthy or powerful being part of the quota to receive aid. And these problems were generally insufficiently understood by aid organizations. Fourth, another example is donor governments having what we often saw is that they have very heightened concerns about diversion to specific armed groups. And so these concerns can lead to extreme concern by aid organizations about the fiduciary risks that they face in these areas, which can result in them not working in certain areas, which results in an imbalance in humanitarian coverage at the country level. And this can compromise, obviously impartiality, but also independence as well. So there can also be ethical risks that aren't necessarily related to the core humanitarian principles, but related to other sort of core principles of humanitarian action as an enterprise. So, for example, aid organizations can often make choices that put affected people in harm's way. So, contradicting the idea of doing no harm. So, for example, the way aid distributions are organized can expose people to additional violence. This came up particularly in Syria and in South Sudan. In Syria, the people who were interviewed felt very exposed to airstrikes whenever they came together for a large gathering, so large distribution. And women in South Sudan were particularly at risk from having to walk long distances to receive food. Another example of putting people in harm's way is national partner organizations. We saw them; they were often not really fully prepared to handle the extreme security risks that they faced, and so this was also an ethical risk for the international organization funding them, and in many cases working through them, with them, and through them. So the paper attempts to provide some suggestions for how organizations can tackle such ethical risks. And really the most important suggestion, which is part of what hopefully discussions like this can contribute to, is to foster a culture within the organization where these kinds of compromises and ethical issues can be discussed openly. So that's the kind of overarching idea. But other suggestions include just really and we saw this in many of the organizations that had some of the better access, really just maintaining a focus on reaching people in need, not just executing programs in the most reachable areas, but always trying to focus on who is most vulnerable and figuring out how to get there. Secondly, in context analysis, this is something that people talk about as important, but really wasn't done as much as I think could be done. So investing in context analysis and really mapping out the political actors around you, so that doesn't just include national actors, but also one's own donors, thinking about them as political actors as well. Thirdly, clarifying what is an organization's policy on negotiation. And generally increasing capacities to be able to do negotiations effectively. There's a huge amount of lack of clarity on that, and we have a separate paper on that topic, on the specific topic of negotiations, because it's such an important issue. Thirdly, looking at funding choices and discussing fiduciary risks with donors. As I mentioned, there's these heightened risks of diversion in very specific areas that we think are tied to political concerns. Another one is documenting difficult situations and what decisions were made, including what were the reasons for not acting. So we did see some organizations doing this very well. There is this problem generally of a lack of institutional memory, but we did see organizations able to do this. So, for example, there was an organization that had very good access in South Sudan that had written documentation of situations that they had faced, documented back to 1996. And then lastly, thinking about the level at which decisions are taken within the organization. So decisions that have major ethical consequences or entail major reputational risks or security risks should be taken by senior management, not by local level staff. Kind of an obvious point, but we did see this sort of outsourcing of decisions to the local staff without much discussion. And lastly, the second chapter of the report encourages agencies to incorporate a consideration of ethical issues into risk management frameworks. So these frameworks are being increasingly used and are more and more popular with aid organizations, but they sort of lack a consideration of the benefit side of the risk-benefit equation. So we've sort of proposed a way to think about the benefits, which is really about thinking about program impact or program criticality and not just thinking about risks. And then Chapter 3 goes into some more detail about some of the ways of thinking about how organizations can actually do this in practice. So I won't go into some of the specifics there, but that's a brief overview of some of the key themes in the report. I encourage you to read it, and I am looking forward to your questions and feedback and to the rest of the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was a really good summary of the key findings and recommendations. I'd now like to move on to our panel. I've got a few questions that I'd like to ask them to respond to, and then we'll open the floor to get your questions and comments. I'm going to start with Abdurrahman on my right here. In your experience, Abdurrahman, in the Somali context, do you think organizations distinguish between fiduciary and security risks when they decide where they're going to operate? And by fiduciary, I mean funds that are not used for the intended purpose, where there's poor value for money, where there might have been a diversion, funds that are not properly accounted for, that sort of thing. So do you think that organizations in the Somali context are distinguishing between those risks and security risks when they make their decisions on where to operate?
I think the discussions and the debates are changing in Somalia. And first of all, I think one thing to highlight is that I think, as mentioned in the research and what's mentioned, the 4 countries that Catherine has mentioned were part of the research are, I think, all high-risk environments. So it's already an environment where it's not easy to operate. In the past, what you've had is that the risk was taken into consideration mainly from the security perspective, and that was what organizations were concentrating a lot. But then in 2011, when the famine in Somalia happened, it created, there were lots of fraud scandals and so on, that changed the perception and pushed people to look also at what we call fiduciary risks. Now, if we talk about distinction between, fiduciary and security risks, I think it can be probably clearer amongst UN agencies and INGOs. But again, also when you talk about NGOs, it depends on the size. Some may have, a capacity to distinguish both, and others may not, depending on the size. It is less clearer amongst local organizations, local NGOs, who may lack financial resources to have, 2 structures in place to deal with it separately, and they're also not able to do so. I think my concern is also that when we talk even about fiduciary risk, it can become very complex because. Especially when you talk about risk appetite, and I think the report talks about a lot about residual risk, if I remember, and some donors come and talk about zero tolerance to risk and fraud. Now that in an environment like Somalia, there are areas where are difficult to access, and sometimes you have to take risks, and risks may be that involuntary. You may want to pay $50 to a militia to be able to deliver humanitarian aid to an IDP or refugee camp. And so the staff on the field has to make that critical decision. But when you have, a zero tolerance policy and you get told that you have zero tolerance policy on such issues, it means I prefer not to work in that area because it's too risky. And even the minimal risk is not acceptable. And what is not clear is if that is, a straightforward policy that's been put in place by donors, or is it just a perception that absolutely we don't accept that. But I think, as I said, from the famine of 2011, we did 2 studies at the NGO consortium looking at risk management procedures and standards. And what we found is that from 2013 to 2015, the situation changed dramatically, whereas agencies didn't have risk procedures or standards in place at that time, they started putting those in place. But again, it depended also on the size and the structure of each of the individual agencies.
And as the director of the consortium, or within the secretariat for the consortium, are you in a position to offer advice to some of those NGOs that maybe haven't done that yet? Or
I think what we're pushing is to have that sort of advice, but there is still a big concern amongst agencies. Is that when you ask for advice, someone will get the information and you're not sure about how that person will treat the information. Sure. And I think people are more concerned about the rumors that will circulate and the impact it can have on an individual agencies rather than the facts. But I think that what we are pushing is for all actors both agencies, NGOs that we represent, but also UN agencies and donors to create incentives so that people can report and talk about those challenges more openly.
Yes, that leads rather nicely on to my next question, which was whether, and this is really directed to you and Imran, whether you think organizations really have made serious efforts to speak openly with donors or their boards about the risks that they're facing, and where do you think the thresholds should be drawn? And if they haven't, why do you think that's the case? And if they have, how's it being received? So do you want to start off and then...
Yeah, I think, as I said, the dynamics have changed. I think, there is efforts to speak to donors about these challenges, but it's still limited because of what I talked about, the rumor phenomena. I think it's easier to talk about it in public spaces when you organize, workshops and you bring all the actors together rather than individually on a one basis. And what we've done in the past 2 years is that, for example, on the security side of things, we talk now more openly on what we call bureaucratic impediments, so illegal taxes, checkpoints, and so on that are in place. In fact, there is an access task force that reports to the HCT in Somalia, which has actually just done a mapping of all the checkpoints in South Somalia and who they're manned by and the type of requests that are there. What we're looking now also is at a mapping of the gatekeeper phenomena in IDP camps in places like Kismayo and Mogadishu, where those things are more relevant. And once we do that mapping, understand how we can challenge those phenomena. But I think also that at the same time, there are also a number of subjects that are difficult to discuss. For example, how do you operate in a territory that is controlled by, Al-Shabaab or a proscribed groups? And also because no agency, wants to reveal its weaknesses, if there are weaknesses, particularly on the fiduciary side of things. Out of the concern that this may have on future funding. But I think also one important thing that the report highlights is also that there is a culture of silence on compromise and corruption.
Don't ask, don't tell.
Don't ask, don't tell. And particularly around paying for access and granting concessions and so on. My other concern is that also, whereas, our priority as humanitarians is always, saving lives, we are shifting from, a focus on programming and saving lives to a focus on managing risks. And I think that's a danger, is that we may not be able to reach the people who are the most in need if we take too much of that approach. And that's why I'm highlighting that we are working on in a high-risk environment, but we also need to take risks and have the right level of balance.
Thank you very much. Imran.
Yes, I think for Islamic relief, I think there's been a change in this discussion from perhaps a few years ago. I mean, a few years ago, we would be able to have very, very open and frank discussions about some of the the traditional risks of those two bad options, negotiating access, issues of armed groups, the challenges of negotiated access, etc. I think we've been perceived as a good direct implementer of aid, and we had good reach, we still have good reach, etc. And I think that those conversations were largely based on those sorts of challenges. What's happened recently for us, I mean, the conversations between ourselves and the donors has changed, and it's been very much in the context of counterterrorism and the challenges of working in a country like Syria, where you have armed groups, some of them we're very familiar with in terms of their profile. So I think those conversations are still open and frank, but I think, in terms of the conversations with institutional donors, they are open and frank and I think very productive. But I think we certainly struggle internally with those conversations. I think there are pressures on, emphasising that we have that sort of USP, that very strong added value in terms of reach and access, but at the same time, accepting that there are certain areas that we actually have physical access to. If we choose to work in those areas, we could do so, but we've chosen not to because we consider the risks of working in an area controlled by a particular armed group to be too high. And that the bigger context includes perceptions of Islamic Relief as a faith-based organisation, an Islamic organisation working in the context of the Middle East. Lots of questions to which we need to provide answers. There's perceptions, there's accusations. We find it very difficult at times. We spend a lot of time defending ourselves in terms of reputational damage, etc. But then we would clearly emphasise to anybody that we're very committed to those humanitarian principles, and we would always consider access and reaching those very vulnerable groups as being paramount. But we do need to consider the impact on staff and increasingly those reputational risks. So I think we are good at having those conversations, but I think it's probably more difficult with some of that maybe our private donors, our major donors, and if we find it a very difficult conversation to have a conversation with a major donor along the lines of we no longer have access to East Aleppo, for example, and that's a very difficult conversation to have because instinctively we are very committed to accessing those very difficult areas, and of course we have a long-term supporter. Those conversations are very productive, but they are very difficult conversations. I think they're difficult to maintain. But in terms of institutional donors, I think we've probably, because we're 32 years old, and if you look at, for example, the Middle East, the first Gulf War was when 1991. So for 20-odd years of our 32 years, we worked in very complex, conflict scenarios. So we're probably a little bit ahead of the game in terms of developing those skill sets in having frank conversations with donors about the reality of access and what we can and can't do. I think probably from many other agencies who have had to get to grips with working in places like Syria, especially in the context of counter-terrorism, have probably had a steeper learning curve in that sense. I think the internal conversations for us are more difficult than those with the donors.
I was going to ask whether you think that there, within the organization, and this would apply to other organizations as well, there's a difference in perception of what is an ethical dilemma or risk at different points in the chain. So if you're at the country level, for example, or in the deep field, for lack of a better term, is your perception of what that risk is different from, say, yours as the director? Do you find that those differences emerge in terms of your discussions around as part of the decision-making process?
There are different perceptions, of course. I think it's correct. I think Catherine did touch on that. Ultimately, it is a senior management decision about where to work and where not to work. We rely very heavily, I think, in terms of that reach and access that I mentioned that we're known for. That comes from very, very good quality local information and discussions. So we are very much guided by what our staff are saying in the field and our country director. Ultimately it will be a senior management decision, but we're very directed by what they say. So I think we have to consider the impact on our staff especially. So, for example, the impact you talk about, my perceptions as, say, UK director involved in sort of fundraising and advocacy this end, I'm not able to do the kind of advocacy work that I'd like to do because the standard text that I would like to put out in terms of, say, raising a particular humanitarian issue in a particular country, I'm told you can't say that because we really fear that if you say that there's significant risk to our staff on the ground. So when you're presented with that kind of reality, it's not that decision is not mine. That has to be a collective decision. I have to consider the impact on staff and the beneficiary groups as well that we're working with. So they are complex. I think it's fair to say that context is not a word that we often hear discussed, and I think contextually what we can do in Syria is very different from what we can do in Yemen. And I think it's about again political consideration. Yemen is not talked about as much as Syria, unfortunately. But there are again some complex regional political consideration when it comes to Yemen. So strange enough, although Syria has its own challenges, we found the advocacy work around Syria has been easier than Yemen for those reasons. So it's very much context, but it's also it's it's timing. It's also how things align at a particular time. A decision that you could make at the beginning of the month is one that you can't make at the end of it. I mean, you have to constantly reassess your position and be fed by different bits of intelligence and sometimes gut feeling. And for an organisation like Islamic Relief, we've had an awful lot to do in terms of protecting our image as an organisation against those accusations that we are somehow linked to a particular group, or so if a bit of aid with an Islamic Relief logo ends up in on the back of a truck, sort of driven by an armed group, that's hugely damaging for us as an organisation.
And more damaging potentially than for another organisation, which isn't.
I mean, WFP would roll with the punches on that one. They would explain the circumstances. Nobody's going to be so quick in accusing the WFP of supporting a particular armed group. They may be accused of being, careless or something, but that's a risk that we all face. But for us, we have to double think everything. So that's shifted us towards the more kind of paranoid end of the spectrum in terms of who we work with. But there's probably more discussion around working with local partners, which is maybe a different question, which I could touch on.
Okay, well, we'll move on to that a bit later. I wanted to go to Fiona now. Fiona, the network paper references Hugo Slims. And I know Hugo's also been he works as an actual employee with the ICRC, I think, but his concept of ethical competence. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about what this means to you and how you think it can be applied in practice in decision-making in high-risk environments.
Okay, thanks, Winnie. And hi, everyone. I just want to say, firstly, though, thank you so much for putting these questions on the agenda. It's been now 22 years that I've been calling for more more discussions around ethics in the aid community. And so I really hope this is going to be the beginning of a much more enriched discussion, because I think the aid community has steered away from these questions for a long time, far too long. So I think this is a wonderful beginning. Because in all my time with MSF, even if they didn't call it ethical decision-making, I mean, the question of the relative harm versus good of aid is always central to the way that MSF has been looking at issues. So when I was the head of MSF, when we pulled out of the Rwandan refugee camps in 1994, it was for ethical reasons, because we felt that our aid was basically strengthening the génocidaire and was being used to harm those people that it was intended to assist. So this has always been MSF's bottom line, and it's a useful bottom line, I think, to carry in all different contexts as a way of thinking about ethical competence. Just that simple equation. When aid is turned against the people as it is intended to assist, then what do you do? And you can apply that to the Rwandan refugee camps, a huge situation like that, or you can apply it to an IDP camp where there is a gatekeeper in control who is actually intentionally keeping the IDPs undernourished and in bad health, so that aid will be attracted to this area, and so that that person or that group of people will be able to, skim off. So that's real exploitation, and it's not unusual. We've seen it in refugee camps all around the world. We've seen it in IDP camps. We've seen it in so many contexts. So these are the kind of ethical decisions that have been central in a lot of what MSF has been doing over the years, or how it has been deciding on what to do and where to do it, whether to stay, whether to pull out, even if it hasn't been explained quite in the same language as ethical competence. So for me, the most important things, obviously, are understanding the principles which make up the ethical framework. So what do they mean for your organisation? Because different organisations will put different emphasis on different principles. If you're a multi-mandate organisation, it will be different from if you are a single-mandate organisation. And then how do you adapt these principles in their context? How are you able to explain them locally? I think one of the interesting initiatives of the ICRC in South Sudan is to try to explain impartiality and neutrality through the wrestling matches that are very much traditional in the newer areas. And so relating the concepts of humanitarian action and the principles, adapting them to the local context so that people can understand them in their own terms. The second major area is observing the power relations that are going on in any place, the political analysis, and to work out are we able to forge a relationship with the community that we are trying to assist. Because if you look at North Korea, if you look at South Sudan during the war, the internal war before the country was split, if you have to have a minder with you, if you are not allowed to have independent access and determine yourself who is in the most need, then you are liable to be directed towards one group against another. So what are the local power relationships? And this is very important in Somalia. How do you avoid capture by the dominant clan in an area? How do you ensure that you can share resources all around so everybody is of benefit? And that's incredibly important ethically, but also for security reasons. Thirdly, deliberating, as Hugo has said, as you've put in your paper, Catherine, deliberating on the best options available in that context. And this includes taking lessons from the past. And as a humanitarian community, we are very, very bad at really taking on board what has happened in the past. As I tried to point out in Condemned to Repeat, there was nothing about the Rwandan refugee situation that was unknown to aid organisations. Camps have been militarised for a long time. All of these paradoxes of aid that I outlined have been going on all the time, and you see them all around us today. So what did we do in the past? How did we do it? And what knowledge do we have available? And we really have an ethical duty to gather information from everywhere. We can't cherry pick information that suits what we would like to do. We have to have discussions with people who are experts in the area, with our local staff, with the local authorities to try to see the best approach. We have to weigh up the potential good versus harm, and this may change over time. I would argue for all the negative consequences that we incurred in the Somali famine of 1992, because in terms of ethical evaluation, MSF did a study into its own contribution to the economy of war way back in 1992 and found that 200,000 euro, no dollars, or I don't know, equivalent at that time probably went into the hands of one of the clans. And this kind of evaluation is very MSFian, as we know, to unpack what you are doing. But this we all need to do a lot more of to really understand and think how can we adjust our policies accordingly. We have to consider innovative ways to do better, and I think you really highlighted some of those, Catherine. And we need to consider the potential consequences of whatever decision we choose to make. And ultimately, I think it's very important in ethical decision making that we have coherence and consistency of judgment. And this is particularly more important in this interconnected world, where if you make a decision about how you're going to react in al-Shabaab-held territory, for instance, it's quite possible that the Taliban will know about this in Afghanistan, in this interconnected world. And so you have to be consistent in the way you are explaining what you're doing and why you are doing it. And then you have to have a very good dose of what Paul Ricoeur called practical wisdom, that sometimes there are really difficult decisions and you need to take the action that most satisfies the exception that least betrays the rules. Sometimes aid organisations take the principles of humanitarian action too much to heart, as if they are dogma, that we have to do this or that, we have to be independent, so we can't act that way. Very often humanitarian principles will come into conflict when you're delivering food, as you mentioned, Catherine, in the report, in Sudan, for instance, to one group, and you have to go past the other group. You've done an assessment. The group whose territory you're passing through do not need the food, but the group at the end of the road do need the food. How are you going to get it to them without having to give something along the way? So you have to sometimes decide, is it more important that I stick to impartiality and only base the aid we're giving on the basis of need, in which case I'm just going to plough through and ignore these people along the road who don't need the aid so much? Or am I going to be a bit pragmatic about that, think about the perceptions of neutrality, and think about, and it's very pragmatic, because if I go through this territory and deliver this aid at the end, there's a very good likelihood that that group of people will be attacked and their aid stolen. So a lot of it is practical wisdom, it's common sense, but it needs to be really thought out and deliberated upon in some of the ways that you've suggested in your report.
Thanks, Fiona. Catherine mentioned that, and the paper talks about risk management frameworks that are becoming more and more popular with agencies to try to, as one tool, to try to help manage some of this decision making. Do you think that these frameworks are helpful in high-risk environments, or do you think they could create more risk aversion? I've heard it described as a sort of freezing effect, where paralyzed by your risk management framework. And if that is the case, how can we avoid that, or how can we improve the way we're doing?
If a tool of decision-making freezes your activities, there's probably a good reason for it, that you've actually worked out that maybe it's too dangerous. I don't really understand how having a tool and putting a framework together around risk management, as long as risk is not just risk for your organisation and not just reputational risk, but risk for the people you're trying to help, risk in a broader sense. And I think too often we don't think about that broader sense. What is the ultimate goal of what I'm doing, and am I able to achieve that? Sometimes we stay very focused on a local area without looking at the impact on the larger area. So I think it's great that we're having these frameworks and a better reflection on ways of going forward. But I definitely would love to echo Abdurrahman's points about honesty, because I think what we need to think about is if we turn a blind eye even within our own staff, you want your staff to be honest, but you know that they're going to have to pay at that checkpoint, but you don't want to hear about it. So they're paying out of their pocket to go through. They're going to recuperate that money by selling your food or the drugs or whatever at the end of the day. So that's one bad consequence of it. But the other thing is, how can you expect people to be honest with you if you don't want to be honest with them? So I think we really need to unpack that and say honesty has to come first. We have to acknowledge that in order to get aid to this group, we will have to pay at these checkpoints. Is that okay or not? And not just to sort of say, oh, the community will pay on our behalf. Then we end up really fueling corruption, I would say, within our own organisation. You're either only honest or dishonest. There's not a lot in between. So if we want honesty, we need to facilitate an atmosphere of honesty.
I have a couple of questions I wanted to address to all of you over the next 10 minutes. Maybe Abdurrahman, we could start with you. In your experience, are there any approaches, formal or informal, that you think help agencies to manage ethical risks or dilemmas? Can coordinated approaches, you're the director of a big consortium, can those coordinated approaches help with decision-making, enable better decision-making?
I think so. And I say, absolutely that coordination is the way forward. Having gatherings where NGOs or different sorts of agencies, UN and others, share experiences is key. And I think, but it's also about context analysis. We've had a few experiences in the past year in Somalia where some authorities wanted to impose taxation or other regimes on us. And we've been able to push back on that by all of us together saying, no, we don't accept that. Because at the end of the day, if you all say no, it means there's nothing they can do to comply. The challenge comes when a group of people say no and a group of people say yes. It sets a precedent, and then you have to follow. But I think for me, what is most important in managing some of these challenges is first of all, context analysis, which was mentioned time and time by Catherine, and I say also perception analysis. How does the community feel about you working in that area? Are they for or are they against it? And the community, I think first of all, what's important is the support from communities. We have areas in Somalia where agencies who've been operating for a number of years have the respect and a good relationship with the community and have been able to push back on a number of practices that were imposed. Others who've been coming, more recently and so on, were not able to do that. Mm-hmm. And so the relationship with the community at the local level is important. But for me, I'd say also the modus operandi of the organization. I've seen challenges where you see, an organization which at headquarter level has all the best practices and the opposite at field level. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a challenge there as well. And as Catherine was saying, It's about communicating local staff with senior management having decisions, right? My question or my comment to that would be, what's the problem with local staff being senior managers, right? You have Somalis, you have Afghanis, you have Syrians who are very capable of doing the job if they get the right level of support and training to manage the job in the appropriate way. And I'd say I stress context analysis because Somalia, for instance, is a very complex environment. And you'll have to spend years in Somalia to really understand the context as you want it. I'll give you an example. The report talks a lot about clan dynamics in Somalia. As a Somali, and maybe that is a bit biased, I don't see clan as a problem. I see the politicization of the clan system and using the clan system for people's own benefits through warlords or militias and so on as the challenge that needs to be addressed and worked around.
Thank you for that. That's very interesting. I mean, Imran, I don't know if you'd like to comment on that. And also, I thought the point you made about the need to constantly reassess, what the ethical risks are, what the risks are more broadly is an important one. And that also chimes with the need to revisit the context analysis, to revisit the perception analysis. It's not a static process.
I will address that, but there's an interesting couple of key words that came out, and I think it's interesting to discuss these as well. I think, Fiona, you mentioned honesty, and then you talked about the need for agencies to sort of coordinate. And I think I have to be honest and say that as international NGOs are not very good at coordinating. And it's a very, very competitive field. And I think, it's not honest to sort of ignore that fact. I have to say there are some very encouraging, changes in, us coordinating. I think you've got things like the START Network, and it's a group of NGOs that have come together. And yes, they are receiving collective funding, but they're also working on a number of operational levels together and sharing experience and looking ahead and sharing that learning. So there are some very good signs that we are changing, but we have to accept that we're still very competitive. And we like to keep certain things very close to our chest, and we would never dream of sharing certain things with other NGOs. I have to be honest, that's the reality of the situation. So I think, yes, we do need to address the issues of coordination. So for us, is we constantly review those factors that affect final intervention, and I think I hope I made it clear that we do feel that in our risk assessment we have those that we serve very much at the heart of that discussion and our staff, but because of those external pressures, perceptions about what Islamic Relief is, who we're working with, our intentions, etc., we are finding that those external factors are putting more and more pressure on those final decisions. So it's interesting to reflect on some of those sort of dilemmas faced in Syria for some of our workers. Andrew Mitchell and a Member of Parliament and Claire Shaw, ex-Secretary of State for International Development, travelled to, both ex-Secretaries of State, of course, travelled to Turkey with the Muslim Charities Forum, and they had a number of conversations with Muslim charities, and they defined what I think they called the Guantanamo effect, I think it was, and it's aid workers being concerned about being found the wrong side of a very fluid front line. So, the fluidity of front lines is something that you have to be very careful of. I mean, at the beginning of the week, there's no discussion about that line being moved, but then suddenly by Friday, there's real serious concern that a particular area, town that we work in, may no longer be controlled by the group that we are developing a relationship with, and it may be held by a particular group that we don't want to have a conversation with, so we need to remove our staff. And that again, what about those that are left behind? So then we're looking at, for example, the risk to those communities. So we need to look at, for example, how good are we at having conversations around self-protection and community-based protection, and getting those communities to at least be able to cope until an agency like Islamic Relief is able to return. So there are many factors that we need to constantly review.
Thanks for that. Now, I've got lots of other questions I'd like to ask, but as it's nearing 11:30, I think what we're going to do is open the floor to the audience so we can have enough time for your questions and comments. And then we can also bring Catherine back in as well. So please if you have questions for Catherine directly, you can ask those. So I'll start with a few questions from the audience in the room, 2 or 3, and then we're already getting questions through from our online audience as well. I'll take them in batches of 2 or 3. Please identify yourself and any organizational affiliation you may have. Let's start with Paul in the front row.